Sometimes a man loses everything before he finds out what he's really made of. For Calden Roury, that moment came at 55, standing in front of a broken cabin with snow driving sideways through strong winds and nothing left but one last chance. Divorced, bankrupt and estranged from his daughter for 3 years, he'd spent his last dollars on this wreck, sight unseen. The roof was caving in, the porch had collapsed, and the wind howled through cracks in the walls. He could have walked away, but he stayed. Through brutal winter storms, he rebuilt that cabin one board at a time, battling the cold and his own demons. He didn't know that fixing those walls would fix something much deeper inside him. What arrived in the letter that spring? Before we find out, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches you, subscribe tomorrow. I've saved something extra special for you. The rusted key turned in the frozen lock with a sound like breaking bones. Calden pushed the door open and was met with a gust of wind that seemed to come from inside the cabin itself, as if the structure was exhaling its last breath. He stood in the doorway, duffel bag hanging from one shoulder, and surveyed what he'd bought with the last of his money. The single room was smaller than he'd imagined. Maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, with a loft space accessible by a ladder so rotted he could see daylight through the rungs. The floor sagged near the center, boards warped and stained dark with water damage. A cast-iron wood stove sat in the corner, its pipe disconnected and leaning at a dangerous angle. The windows, what remained of them, were either cracked or missing entirely, covered with yellowed plastic that snapped and billowed in the wind. Snow had drifted through the gaps, creating small white dunes against the interior walls. This was it. This was home now. Calden set his bag down and walked to the center of the room, testing each board before putting his full weight. On it, the cabin groaned beneath him like an old man struggling to rise. He looked up at the ceiling and saw patches of daylight through holes in the roof. Water stains spread across the rough-hewn beams in patterns that looked like continents on a map. 5 years ago, he'd been standing in a glass-walled office overlooking downtown, presenting designs for a 40-story mixed-use development to a room full of investors. His firm had employed 32 people. He'd worn suits that cost more than some people's monthly rent and had driven a car that purred like a satisfied cat. 5 years ago, his daughter Bryn had been 23, fresh out of college, calling him every Sunday to tell him about her new job, her new apartment, her life unfolding the way lives are supposed to unfold. 5 years ago, he'd been married to Patricia for 26 years, and while they'd grown distant, he'd assumed they had time to find their way back to each other. Then the economy shifted. A key investor pulled out. Projects stalled. Contractors demanded payment he couldn't provide. He'd borrowed against everything, the house, his retirement, his reputation. He'd been certain he could turn it around, certain that one more deal would save everything. He'd been wrong. The firm collapsed in 18 months. The bankruptcy took another year to finalize. Patricia left halfway through, and he couldn't blame her. He'd become someone she didn't recognize, silent, angry, disappearing into work that no longer existed, drinking too much and saying too little. But losing Bryn, that was the wound that wouldn't close. She'd tried at first, called him, invited him to dinner, suggested therapy. He'd pushed her away with every defense mechanism a proud man could muster, cancelled plans, ignored calls, told her he was fine when he clearly wasn't. He'd convinced himself he was protecting her from his failure, that keeping his distance was a kindness. The last time they'd spoken was 3 years ago. She'd called on his birthday, and he'd been drunk at 2 in the afternoon, sitting in a studio apartment that smelled like defeat. She'd asked if she could come see him, and he'd told her not to bother. Said he was busy. Said he'd call her back. He never did. A week later, she'd sent a text. "I needed you, and you weren't there." Eventually, he'd put the phone down without sending anything. What could he say? She was right. Calden pulled himself back to the present, to the freezing cabin that was somehow supposed to be his salvation. He had maybe 3 hours of daylight left, and the temperature was already dropping. First priority, make this place survivable for the night. He found a tarp in his truck and nailed it over the worst of the roof holes from the inside, standing on a chair that wobbled with each hammer strike. He stuffed rags and spare clothes into the window gaps, creating a patchwork of barriers against the wind. The wood stove's pipe he managed to reconnect, though it sat at a crooked angle that would probably violate every building code ever written. Getting a fire started took 20 minutes and most of his newspaper. The wood he'd brought was damp, and the stove smoked badly until the flue finally drew properly. But eventually, heat began to radiate into the space, and Calden felt his hands start to thaw. He ate dinner straight from the can, cold beans, not bothering to heat them, and washed it down with water from a jug. No electricity meant no lights, so he set up 2 battery-powered lanterns that cast shadows, dancing across the rough walls. The wind screamed outside, rattling the boards and finding every gap he hadn't sealed. Calden unrolled his sleeping bag on the least damaged section of floor and sat down heavily. His body ached from the drive, from the cold, from the weight of everything that had led him here. He was 55 years old, sleeping on the floor of a cabin that might collapse on him in the night, with exactly $237 to his name and no plan beyond surviving until morning. From his duffel bag, he pulled out a water-stained photograph, one of the few possessions he'd kept through everything. It showed him and Bryn at a lake, maybe 15 years ago. She was 10 or 11, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a fish that was barely bigger than her hand. His younger self stood behind her, hands on her shoulders, smiling in a way he couldn't remember how to do anymore. He studied it in the lantern light. When had he lost that? Not just the ability to smile, but the ability to be present for someone other than himself. When had pride become more important than his own daughter? The photograph had survived 3 years in a storage unit, protected in a folder with a handful of other irreplaceable things. Birth certificates, the deed to this cabin, his father's death certificate, the small archive of a collapsed life. Calden propped the photo against the wall, where he could see it from his sleeping bag. The fire popped and hissed in the stove. Wind drove snow against the walls in waves that sounded like static. He thought about Bryn's text message, still saved on his phone, even though the battery had died weeks ago. "I needed you, and you weren't there." 7 words that contained an entire history of failure. The cabin settled around him with creaks and groans. Somewhere in the rafters, mice probably skittered across wood. The tarp over the ceiling holes rippled and snapped. Through the gaps he hadn't sealed, he could see snow falling in the moonlight, each flake visible for a moment, before the darkness swallowed it. This was his last chance. Not just at having a roof over his head, but at becoming someone worth knowing again. Someone who finished what he started. Someone who might, somehow, find a way back to his daughter. If he survived the night. Calden pulled the sleeping bag tight around himself and closed his eyes, listening to the storm rage against the walls he'd have to make strong enough to withstand it. The storm came 3 days later with a fury that made the first snowfall seem like a gentle warning. Calden had spent those 3 days learning the cabin's weaknesses. Every gust of wind taught him where the drafts lived. Every creak told him which boards were sound and which were rotting from within. He'd patched what he could with materials scavenged from the collapsed porch, nailing boards over the broken windows, reinforcing the door frame, clearing snow from what remained of the roof. It wasn't enough. The blizzard hit at dusk on the 3rd night, and within an hour the world outside disappeared into a white void. Wind hammered the cabin from every direction at once, finding gaps he didn't know existed. Snow forced its way through cracks in horizontal streams, accumulating on the floor faster than he could sweep it out. Calden fed the fire and tried to stay calm. He'd survived storms before. This was just weather. It would pass. But as the night deepened, the wind's pitch changed from a howl to a scream. The entire structure shuddered with each gust, and he began to hear new sounds, sharp cracks from the rafters, the groan of wood under impossible strain. He looked up and saw the ceiling beams bowing inward, sagging under the weight of accumulating snow. He'd underestimated the load. The roof had been weak to begin with, and he hadn't accounted for the sheer volume of snow a storm like this could deposit. Around midnight, he was dozing in his sleeping bag when a sound like a gunshot jolted him awake. A rafter had cracked near the center of the ceiling. He watched in horror as the split widened, saw the beam sag another few inches. Snow began sifting through the gap in a steady stream. Calden scrambled out of his sleeping bag and grabbed the support pole he'd been using as a makeshift brace. He wedged it under the sagging beam, trying to redistribute the weight, but the pole itself was questionable lumber, and he could feel it flexing under the load. He needed to get outside and clear the snow from the roof. Now, before the whole thing came down. The wind nearly tore the door from his hands when he opened it. Snow blasted into his face with stinging force, and he couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The cold was beyond anything he'd experienced, a physical presence that pressed against his chest and made each breath painful. He forced his way around to the side of the cabin, where the lean-to overhang gave him access to the lower roof section. The ladder he'd improvised from scrap wood was already half buried. He kicked snow away from it and began to climb, each step a fight against wind that tried to peel him away from the wall. On the roof, he couldn't stand. The wind was too strong, the pitch too steep with accumulated snow. He crawled on his hands and knees, using a broken shovel to push snow toward the edges. His gloves were soaked through within minutes. His face went numb. Ice formed in his beard and eyebrows. He worked in a kind of desperate trance, shoveling, crawling, trying to clear enough weight to save the structure. Below him, through the wind's roar, he heard another crack. The section of roof beneath him dropped 6 inches. Calden threw himself toward the ladder, but his numb hands couldn't grip properly. He slid down the slope of the roof, scrabbling for purchase, and tumbled over the edge. He hit the snowbank below hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs and lay there for a moment, stunned, staring up at the cabin's dark silhouette against the swirling white. "Get up, get inside. Freeze to death out here." He dragged himself to his feet and staggered back to the door. Inside, the support pole had shifted, and a section of ceiling near the loft had partially collapsed. Debris boards, insulation, snow covered half the floor. The fire in the stove had nearly gone out. Calden stood dripping in the doorway, looking at the destruction, and something inside him broke. Not the cabin. Him. He sank to his knees among the debris and put his face in his frozen hands. Everything he touched fell apart. His business, his marriage, his relationship with his daughter. And now this, his last gamble, his final attempt at building something, was literally collapsing around him. What was he doing here? What had made him think he could fix this place when he couldn't fix anything else in his life? His numb fingers found the photograph where it had fallen, now dusted with snow and insulation. He wiped it on his wet jacket and stared at the image. That little girl with the gap-toothed smile, the man who'd believed he could protect her from anything. Both of them were gone now. Calden's phone was in his jacket pocket, nearly dead but still holding a charge. He turned it on with shaking hands and scrolled to the last message from Bryn. 3 years old. 7 words. "I needed you, and you weren't there." He read it again, and suddenly he was crying, harsh sobs that hurt his chest, tears freezing on his cheeks almost as soon as they fell. Not quiet grief, but something raw and animal, the sound of a man confronting every failure at once. He'd built a career on creating structures that would last, buildings that would stand for generations. But he'd never built anything that mattered. Not really. He'd built monuments to his own ambition while neglecting the only structure that should have been sacred, his family. And when it all fell apart, when Bryn had reached out, when she'd needed him most, he'd hidden. told himself he was protecting her from his failure. But that was a lie. He'd been protecting himself from having to face what he'd lost. The wind screamed through the gaps in the broken ceiling. Snow continued to fall on his head and shoulders. The cabin groaned and settled, and for a moment he thought it might finish collapsing right then. But it held. Barely, but it held. Calden looked up at the damaged rafters, at the support pole straining under weight it was never meant to bear, at the patchwork of boards and tarps and desperate repairs. This cabin was broken. It had been abandoned, left to rot, given up on, just like he'd been ready to give up on himself. He stood slowly, his legs unsteady, and walked to the stove, fed it the last of his dry wood, watched the flames catch and grow. Then he found his duffel bag and pulled out a notebook he'd bought at a gas station weeks ago but had never opened. He sat by the stove, wrapped in a blanket, hands still shaking from cold and emotion, and began to write. Day 4. The roof nearly collapsed tonight. I nearly gave up, but something changed. Maybe it was seeing Bryn's message again. Maybe it was realizing I've spent 3 years running from my own cowardice. This cabin is broken. I'm broken. But broken things can be rebuilt. It will take everything I have. But I don't have anything else anyway. I'm not just fixing a roof anymore. I'm proving to myself, and maybe someday to her, that I can finish something, that I can take something ruined and make it whole. I'm staying. He closed the notebook and looked at the photograph one more time before tucking it safely into his jacket's inner pocket, close to his heart. Outside, the storm continued its assault. Inside, Calden Roury stopped running. The morning after the storm broke cold and crystalline. Calden woke to sunlight streaming through the collapsed section of ceiling, dust motes dancing in the beams like tiny stars. His entire body ached. His fingers were still swollen from frostbite, and every joint protested when he tried to move. But he was alive. And the cabin, somehow, was still standing. He spent the morning clearing debris, sorting what could be salvaged from what needed to be thrown out. The loft ladder was beyond repair. 3 rafters were cracked and would need replacing. The support pole had held, but it was bowed now, stressed beyond its capacity. By noon, he'd made a list. He needed lumber, nails, roofing material, proper insulation, and tools beyond the basic hammer and saw he'd brought. He needed supplies he couldn't afford. The truck started on the 3rd try, battery weak from the cold. Calden drove down the mountain road carefully, following tire tracks from some earlier traveler through snow that had drifted 3 feet deep in places. The nearest town was 15 miles away, a collection of buildings that looked like they'd been there since before anyone bothered with modern conveniences. Booker's Hardware sat on the main street, a low building with faded red paint and a hand-lettered sign that had seen better decades. Calden parked out front and sat for a moment, gathering himself. He hadn't spoken to another human being in days. Wasn't sure he remembered how. Inside, the store smelled like sawdust and oil, and something else, age maybe, or permanence. Aisles of bins and boxes stretched back into shadows. Everything looked used, repurposed, salvaged from other projects and other lives. An old man stood behind the counter, reading a newspaper spread across the scratched surface. He looked up as Calden entered, his eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. "Help you?" His voice carried the gravel of a lifetime of cigarettes. "Need some supplies." Calden pulled out his list, the paper crumpled from being in his pocket. Lumber, mostly. Some roofing material. The old man, Booker, according to the name stitched on his work shirt, came around the counter and took the list. He studied it for a long moment, then looked at Calden with new interest. "You're the one bought the old Pritchard place." It wasn't a question. "That's right. Seen it. Roof's gone. Foundation's questionable. Probably got raccoons in the walls." Booker handed back the list. "What makes you think it's worth saving?" Calden met his gaze. Don't have anywhere else to go. Something shifted in Booker's expression. Not pity. Exactly. Recognition, maybe. He nodded once. All right, then. Let's see what we can do. They walked the aisles together, Booker pulling items from shelves and bins with the efficiency of a man who knew where everything was without having to look. When they returned to the counter, the pile of supplies represented more money than Calden had. Comes to 460, Booker said, adding numbers on a calculator that probably predated Calden's birth. Calden's stomach sank. I've got 237. Booker looked at him for a long moment. You know anything about building? Used to. Was an architect. Long time ago. Architect. Booker's tone suggested that might not be a point in Calden's favor. Can you frame a wall? Run a straight line? Yes. Can you use a level? The question triggered a memory so sharp it hurt. Calden reached into his jacket's inner pocket and pulled out a brass and wood level, old but perfectly maintained. His father's. He'd found it in the truck's toolbox that morning while looking for salvageable materials. Booker took the level, held it up to the light, checked its bubble. A slow smile crossed his weathered face. Your daddy's? Yes. He teach you, right? He tried to. Booker set the level on the counter between them with a gentleness that suggested he understood its value. I'll spot you the difference. 223. Pay me when you can. No interest, but I expect payment. Calden stared at him. You don't know me. Know enough. Know you're still up there after that storm. Know you got your daddy's level and actually take care of it. Know you're looking at that lumber like a man who plans to use it right. Booker began loading supplies into boxes. Besides, you don't pay me. I know where you live. The joke landed with surprising warmth. Calden felt something in his chest loosen slightly. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You're gonna earn it. That cabin's gonna fight you every step of the way. They loaded the truck in silence. As Calden was about to leave, Booker stopped him. One more thing. He disappeared into a back room and returned with a battered toolbox. Some extra bits. Saw blades, drill bits, things you're gonna need. Call it a loan like the rest. Calden took the toolbox, surprisingly heavy. Why are you doing this? Booker leaned against the doorframe, studying him. Had a place like that once. Cabin up near the state line. Went there after my boy died. Thought I'd drink myself to death in peace. He paused, looking past Calden at something only he could see. Didn't work out that way. Place needed too much fixing. Kept finding one more thing to repair, one more board to replace. By the time it was habitable, I'd forgotten I was trying to die. The words hung in the cold air between them. You get it fixed? Calden asked quietly. Eventually. Sold it to a young family couple years back. They've got kids up there now. Kids that never would have existed if I'd managed to drink myself into the ground. Booker met his eyes. Sometimes a man needs something to fix besides himself. Calden nodded, not trusting his voice. You get stuck up there. You got my number on the receipt. Weather turns bad again, you call. Don't be stupid about pride. The drive back up the mountain felt different. The truck bed was full of lumber and possibility. The toolbox sat on the passenger seat beside him, solid and real. His father's level rested on top of it. Calden thought about the old man at the hardware store, about his casual grace in extending credit to a stranger, about his story of loss and accidental redemption through the simple act of repairing what was broken. When he pulled up to the cabin, it looked simultaneously worse and better than he remembered. Worse because the daylight revealed every flaw. Better because now he had the materials to address them. He unloaded the truck methodically, stacking lumber on the clearest section of ground, organizing supplies under the tarp he'd rigged as a temporary shelter. His hands moved with growing confidence, remembering skills he'd thought were buried under years of architectural drawings and client meetings. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Calden stood on the cleared foundation with his father's level in his hands. He held it against one of the surviving support posts, watched the bubbles settle. Not level, not even close. But that was all right. That's what rebuilding was for. He opened his notebook and wrote, Asterisk, Day 5. Met a man named Booker who gave me credit when he had no reason to trust me. Learned that sometimes strangers see something in us we've forgotten to see in ourselves. Tomorrow, I start on the roof. One board at a time. Asterisk. 3 weeks passed in a blur of sawdust and sweat and small victories. Calden fell into a rhythm that his body remembered even if his mind had forgotten. Up before dawn, when the air was so cold, it hurt to breathe. Coffee made from snow melted on the wood stove, bitter and strong. Then work until his hands couldn't grip the hammer anymore, until the light failed, until exhaustion pulled him towards sleep despite the cold. The roof came first. He tore away the damaged sections, exposing the skeleton of rafters beneath. Some were salvageable. Others had to be replaced, cut to length with a hand saw that left his arms trembling. He worked with his father's level constantly at hand, checking and rechecking every angle, every joint. The precision felt like prayer. His hands changed. Blisters formed and broke and formed again, eventually hardening into calluses. His fingers, swollen from frostbite that first terrible night, regained their dexterity. The ache in his shoulders became familiar, almost comforting proof that he was doing something real. The land changed too. As the weeks wore on, winter began its slow retreat. The sun climbed higher each day. Snow melted from the south-facing slopes, revealing brown grass and patches of bare earth. Birds returned, first the ravens, then smaller species Calden couldn't name. Their songs filled the valley in the early mornings, a sound he'd forgotten cities didn't have. A doe appeared one evening while he was working on the porch supports. She stood at the tree line maybe 30 yards away, watching him with dark eyes that held no fear, only curiosity. Calden froze, hammer halfway to nail. They regarded each other for a long moment before she turned and disappeared into the forest with movements so graceful they seemed choreographed. He saw her again 2 days later, and then regularly, always at dusk, always keeping her distance but present. Witnessing. The cabin slowly transformed. New boards replaced rotten ones. The roof became whole, properly sealed against weather. He insulated the walls with material Booker had included in his supplies, working from the inside out, sealing gaps that had made the structure uninhabitable. But the evenings were the hardest, when the work stopped and the silence settled in, when there was nothing to do but sit by the fire and feel the weight of everything he'd lost. That's when he tried to write to Bryn. He filled pages with attempts, crossed them out, started over. Each version felt wrong, too formal, too casual, too apologetic, not apologetic enough. How did you compress 3 years of silence into words that wouldn't sound hollow? Asterisk. Dear Bryn, I know I have no right to contact you after so long. Asterisk. Too stiff. He crumpled the page and threw it into the fire. Asterisk. Bryn, I've been thinking about you and wanted you to know. Asterisk. Wanted her to know what? That he'd been too much of a coward to reach out sooner? He burned that one too. Asterisk. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it, but I don't have better words. Asterisk. The flames consumed his inadequate attempts one after another until he had a pile of ash and still no letter worth sending. On his 4th trip to town for supplies, Calden arrived to find another customer at Booker's counter, a younger man, maybe 35, with the build of someone who worked with his hands and the easy confidence of someone who knew his craft. Calden, this is Fitch, Booker said. Does contracting work around the valley? Fitch, this is the one I told you about, bought the Pritchard place. Fitch extended a hand, his grip firm. Heard you're fixing it up yourself. That's ambitious. Don't have much choice. Fair enough. Fitch leaned against the counter. If you need any help, I'm around. Always looking for side work. Can't afford help. Didn't say you had to pay me. Just said I'm around. Fitch smiled. Gets boring in the off-season. Sometimes I like an interesting project, Booker snorted. What he means is he's nosy and wants to see if you're doing it right. That too, Fitch admitted easily. As Calden loaded his purchases, Fitch followed him outside. Listen, I'm not trying to step on your toes, but that cabin, I know its history. Previous owner was a man named Pritchard, lived up there alone for 12 years. They found him one winter, frozen in his chair. Heart attack probably, but he'd been dead for weeks before anyone thought to check. The information settled cold in Calden's stomach. Why are you telling me this? Because isolation does things to people, makes them forget they're part of the world, makes them think they have to do everything alone. Fitch met his eyes. You got my number if you need it. That's all. The drive back up the mountain felt longer than usual. Calden thought about Pritchard, dying alone in the cabin he was now trying to rebuild. Wondered what the man's story had been. What had driven him to that isolated place, whether he'd chosen solitude or had it thrust upon him. That night, wrapped in blankets by the fire, Calden pulled out his notebook. But instead of trying to write to Bryn, he wrote about the cabin itself. Day 23. Learned today that the previous owner died here alone. Nobody missed him for weeks. I understand that danger. Understand how easy it would be to disappear into this place, to let the isolation become permanent. But I'm not Pritchard. I'm not here to hide from the world. I'm here because I need to learn how to be part of it again, how to build something that matters. The doe came again tonight, closer this time. I've started calling her Grace, though I know that's foolish. She doesn't need a name from me. But there's something about her presence that feels like permission, like the land accepting that I might belong here. Still can't find the right words for Bryn. Every attempt feels inadequate. How do you apologize for 3 years of absence? How do you explain that you were drowning and thought the kindest thing was to drown alone? Maybe I'm not supposed to explain. Maybe I'm just supposed to tell the truth. I was wrong. I was a coward. And I'm sorry. He stared at those last 3 sentences for a long time. Simple, direct, honest. Maybe that was enough to start with. He turned to a fresh page and began again, but this time he didn't try to craft the perfect letter. He just wrote what he felt. Bryn, I was wrong about everything. I thought staying away was protecting you from my failures, but I was really just protecting myself from having to face what I'd lost. I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I think about you every day, and I'm trying to become someone worthy of being your father again. It wasn't eloquent, it wasn't polished, but it was true. Calden folded the page carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket next to the photograph. He wasn't ready to send it yet, wasn't sure he'd ever be ready. But having the words written down felt like progress. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like distant voices. Grace stood at the tree line, barely visible in the moonlight. Calden raised a hand in greeting, and she dipped her head once before melting back into the shadows. The fire crackled. The cabin settled around him with familiar creaks. And for the first time in 3 years, Calden Roury didn't feel entirely alone. Late winter turned to early spring with a slowness that felt almost reverent. Ice retreated from the edges of the creek that ran through the valley. Buds appeared on the aspens. The snow that had seemed eternal began to thin, revealing the bones of the land beneath. Calden's cabin transformed with it. The structure was sound now, weatherproof, no longer fighting a losing battle against the elements. He'd moved beyond emergency repairs into something else, creation. Building rather than just fixing. He started with a table. Nothing fancy, just 4 legs and a top made from pine boards he'd planed smooth by hand. But as he worked, something shifted in him. His hands remembered not just the mechanics of carpentry, but the artistry of it. The way grain could be highlighted or hidden, the satisfaction of a joint that fit perfectly without force. The table took 3 days. Then chairs, 2 of them, sturdy and simple with backs that curved just enough for comfort, a bed frame to get him off the floor, shelves for his few possessions. Each piece he made with more care than necessary, finding pleasure in the small details that no one else would ever notice. One sleepless night, restless with energy he couldn't quite name, Calden found himself with a piece of scrap pine and his father's old pocket knife. He began to carve without planning, just letting his hands move. An hour later, he held a small bird, wings spread in flight, no bigger than his palm. He stared at it in the lamplight, surprised by what he'd made. The bird wasn't perfect. The proportions were slightly off, one wing thicker than the other, but it was alive in a way he couldn't quite explain. It had personality, character. When had he last made something just because he wanted to? Not for a client, not for approval, not for money, just for the simple joy of creation. He couldn't remember. His architecture firm had started small, born from genuine love of design and building. But success had changed it, changed him. The firm grew, took on corporate clients, began designing structures that were financially impressive but spiritually empty. Glass towers that could have been anywhere, built for investors who would never set foot inside them. He'd been so focused on the business of architecture that he'd forgotten the art of it. Forgotten what had drawn him to the profession in the first place, the idea that buildings could shelter not just bodies but dreams, that spaces could be crafted to make people feel something. The wooden bird sat on his new table, catching the firelight. A small thing, imperfect, but more honest than anything he'd designed in the last decade of his career. The mail came on a Tuesday, delivered by Booker, who made the trip up the mountain in his pickup. Calden saw the dust trail long before the truck arrived and met him on the newly rebuilt porch. "Got some things forwarded from your old address," Booker said, handing over a stack of envelopes. "Figured you'd want them sooner rather than later." Calden flipped through the stack. Junk mail mostly, bills for accounts that no longer existed, then a larger envelope, official-looking, from a law firm he recognized. His divorce attorney. "Thanks for bringing it up." Booker nodded, looking past him at the cabin. "Place is coming along. Looks solid. Getting there. You eaten today?" The question caught Calden off guard. "Coffee counts, doesn't it? Come down to the diner Friday evening." "My treat. You're starting to look like a scarecrow." Booker climbed back into his truck. "Isolation's one thing, starvation's another." After Booker left, Calden sat on the porch steps with the envelope in his hands. He knew what it contained. The final divorce papers, property settlement documents. The legal dissolution of 26 years, reduced to signatures and notary stamps. He opened it carefully. Read through the papers once, then again. Everything was as expected. Patricia had been fair, more than fair, considering the circumstances. She'd taken only what was hers, left him with what little remained. There was even a note in her handwriting. Asterisk, Calden, I hope you're well, wherever you are. I don't harbor anger anymore. We both lost something, and I'm sorry it ended the way it did. I'm moving forward with my life. I hope you can too. P. Asterisk. The note was kind, generous, even. And it carried news she hadn't felt obligated to share a wedding invitation tucked between the legal documents. Patricia Roury was becoming Patricia Langford in 6 weeks. A small ceremony, family only. Calden sat with that information for a long time, waiting for pain that didn't come. He felt something, nostalgia maybe, or melancholy for who they'd been before everything collapsed. But not jealousy, not resentment. Just a quiet acknowledgement that she'd moved on while he'd been frozen in place. Good for her. She deserved happiness. He signed the papers carefully, his signature different than it had been 3 years ago, less flourish, more substance. Tucked them back into the envelope with the wedding invitation. He'd mail them back from town on Friday. That evening, he wrote in his journal, asterisk, day 47, Divorce is final. Patricia is remarrying. I thought this would hurt more than it does. Instead, I feel freed. Not from her, I let her go years ago without realizing it. Freed from the weight of who I thought I was supposed to be. Asterisk, asterisk, made a bird from scrap wood last night. Can't explain why, but it felt important. Like remembering a language I used to speak fluently. Asterisk, asterisk. The cabin is becoming a home. Not just shelter, but a place that reflects intention. Every board I place, every joint I fit, feels like a small act of redemption, like I'm building my way back to being human. Asterisk, asterisk. Still haven't sent the letter to Bryn. Keep finding reasons to wait. The truth is, I'm afraid. Afraid she won't respond. Afraid she will. Afraid of what comes next. Either way. Asterisk, asterisk. But fear is just another form of pride, isn't it? Another way of making this about me instead of about her. Asterisk. He pulled out the folded letter he'd written weeks ago. Read it again. The words still felt true, if inadequate. Maybe they would always be inadequate. Maybe that was the point, acknowledging that no words could undo what he'd done, but offering them anyway. Calden found an envelope in his supplies, addressed it in careful handwriting to Bryn's last known address. Probably she'd moved. Probably the letter would come back, undeliverable. But he had to try. He sealed it before he could second-guess himself, propped it on the table next to the wooden bird. He'd mail it Friday along with the divorce papers. 2 letters, 2 chapters, closing or opening depending on how you looked at it. Outside, the stars emerged one by one against the deepening blue. Grace appeared at the tree line, her evening ritual. Calden raised his coffee mug in salute. "To moving forward," he said aloud, his voice strange in the quiet. The doe flicked her ears, then stepped closer than she ever had before, close enough that he could see the detail of her face, the liquid darkness of her eyes. They regarded each other for a long moment, some understanding passing between them that had nothing to do with words. Then she was gone, and Calden was alone again. But it was a different kind of alone now, less like exile, more like peace. Spring arrived in earnest, and with it came a softness to the mountain air that Calden had almost forgotten existed. The creek ran full with snowmelt, its sound a constant presence that filled the valley. Wildflowers began pushing through the thawing earth, small purple blooms he couldn't name, but that turned the meadow into something worthy of a painting. The cabin was nearly finished. Proper windows installed, their glass catching morning light and throwing it across walls he'd sealed and insulated. The porch was solid now, complete with railings he'd carved with simple but deliberate patterns. A person could sit out there with coffee and watch the world wake up without worrying the structure would collapse beneath them. Calden had developed habits that felt like rituals, morning coffee on the porch. Full day of work, he'd started taking small carpentry jobs from Booker, repairs and custom pieces for people in town. Evening journal entry. And every night before sleep, he'd hold the wooden bird he'd carved and think about Bryn. The letter sat on his table for 2 weeks, before he finally took it to town. Stood in the post office with the envelope in his hand, staring at his daughter's name in his own careful handwriting. The postal clerk, a woman named Odette, who looked like she'd been born behind that counter, waited patiently. "You mailing that, or just visiting it?" she finally asked, not unkindly. Calden handed it over. Watched her weigh it, stamp it, toss it into the outgoing bin with all the mundane mail that moved through her hands every day. His heart and his hope reduced to first-class postage. "Takes about 3 days," Odette said. 5, if it's going rural." He nodded, unable to speak, and left before she could see the emotion on his face. That Friday, he met Booker at the diner as promised. The place was small, worn, comfortable in the way places become when they've served the same people for generations. They sat in a booth with cracked vinyl seats, and Booker ordered for both of them without asking meatloaf, mashed potatoes, coffee that could strip paint. "You're looking better," Booker said when the food arrived. "Still too thin, but better. Cabin's almost done. Noticed. Saw the porch work. That's fine craftsmanship." Booker cut into his meatloaf. "Got a table needs building. Customer wants something specific. Oak, 6 feet, has to seat 8. You interested? I don't have a workshop. Use mine. Got space gathering dust since I stopped taking custom orders." Booker waved his fork dismissively. "Pay you fair rate. Keep you busy till you figure out what comes next." What comes next? As if Calden had any idea. "Why are you doing this?" Calden asked. "The credit, the work, all of it. You don't know me." Booker set down his fork and looked at him with those sharp eyes that seemed to see through pretense. "Told you about my boy. What I didn't tell you is why he died. Overdose. Pills first, then harder stuff. I knew he was struggling, knew he needed help. But I was proud, and he was proud, and neither of us would bend first." He paused, took a drink of coffee. "By the time I swallowed my pride and reached out, it was too late. Found him in his apartment, 3 days gone. Landlord called me to clean out his things." Booker's voice stayed steady, but Calden could hear the weight beneath it. "Spent a year after that, wondering if I'd reached out sooner, been less concerned with being right, whether he'd still be here. I'm sorry. Don't need your sorry. Need you to understand something." Booker met his eyes. "Pride's a cold companion up here. It'll keep you warm about, as well as it kept me after my boy died. You got a daughter you're not speaking to. I can see it in you, the way you carry that weight. Whatever happened between you, don't let pride finish the job." Calden thought about the letter, already on its way to an address that might not even be current anymore. "I wrote to her. Mailed it today." "Good, that's good." Booker nodded approval. "What you say? That I was wrong, that I'm sorry, that I'm trying to be better. That's all any of us can say." Booker pushed a piece of paper across the table. "That's the table specs. Customers in no rush. Take your time, do it right." They finished their meal in comfortable silence. On the way out, Booker clasped his shoulder. "You did good, fixing that place. Not many men would have stuck it out." Driving back up the mountain, Calden thought about Booker's son, about pride and silence and all the things left unsaid until it was too late. About the letter he'd finally sent and the response that might never come. He'd been organizing his few belongings when he found it tucked in with old receipts and gas station maps, a birthday card he'd bought 2 years ago. For Bryn's 26th birthday. He'd written in it, sealed it, addressed it, and then never sent it. He opened it now with hands that shook slightly. Asterisk. "Happy birthday, Bryn. I know I haven't been present, and I know this card doesn't make up for that. I think about you every day. I hope you're happy. I hope you've built a life you're proud of. Love, Dad." Asterisk. Safe words, careful words, words that said everything and nothing at the same time. He'd been too afraid to send even this, too afraid that reaching out would make his failures real, that her silence in response would confirm what he already suspected, that he'd lost her completely. Calden sat on his finished porch with the card in his hands and let himself feel the full weight of 2 years of cowardice. Not just the 3 years since they'd last spoken, but every moment since then that he could have reached out and didn't. That night, he wrote in his journal, with brutal honesty, Asterisk, Day 61. Found the birthday card I never sent. Booker told me about his son today, about pride and regret and learning too late that being right matters less than being present. Asterisk, asterisk. I mailed a letter to Bryn 3 days ago. Odds are good she's moved and it'll come. Back undeliverable. But I sent it anyway, because Booker's right pride is a cold companion. Asterisk, asterisk. The cabin is finished. I should feel accomplished, but mostly I feel exposed. Like I've been hiding behind work, using the building as an excuse not to think about what comes after. Well, after is here now. The walls are solid, the roof is sound, and I have to face the fact that I might have fixed the cabin, but it's too late to fix what really matters. Asterisk, asterisk. Tomorrow I start on Booker's table, keep my hands busy, keep moving forward. Because stopping means drowning in the might-have-beens. Asterisk. He closed the journal and looked at the wooden bird, sitting on the windowsill where it caught the last light. Small and imperfect and somehow exactly right. Grace appeared at the tree line, her presence now so regular it felt like she belonged to the place as much as he did, maybe more. I tried, he said to her, to the mountain, to whatever was listening. That has to count for something. The wind moved through the pines, and somewhere in the valley, spring continued its patient work of renewal. The response came 6 weeks after he'd mailed the letter, on a morning when Calden had almost convinced himself it wasn't coming at all. He'd finished Booker's table 3 days earlier, 8 feet of white oak, hand-rubbed with oil until it glowed like honey in sunlight. The work had consumed him, given him purpose beyond the cabin's completion. He'd moved into Booker's workshop, spending long days measuring twice and cutting once, fitting joints with the precision his father had taught him decades ago. The table was beautiful. Even Booker had stood silent for a long moment when Calden showed him the finished piece, running his weathered hands across the surface with something like reverence. "Your daddy would be proud," was all he'd said, but it was enough. Calden had returned to the cabin that evening, feeling accomplished but unmoored. The table was done. The cabin was done. He had a little money now from the job, enough to last a few months if he was careful. But what was he building toward? What came next when you'd rebuilt everything except the thing that mattered most? He woke the next morning to the sound of a vehicle on the access road, unusual enough to bring him immediately alert. Booker's truck appeared through the trees, dust trailing behind it. Calden met him on the porch, coffee in hand. "Bringing more work already? Brought your mail." Booker handed over a small bundle. "Figured you'd want it sooner than later. Bills, mostly. A circular from a hardware supplier. And then, beneath the junk, a thin envelope with unfamiliar handwriting. Not quite feminine, but not masculine either. Careful letters that suggested someone who'd learned to write with deliberation. The return address was from a city 3 states away. No name, just an address. Calden's hands went still. "You want privacy?" Booker asked quietly. He nodded, not trusting his voice. Booker squeezed his shoulder once and left without another word. The truck's engine faded down the mountain, and Calden was alone with the envelope that might contain everything or nothing. He sat on the porch steps, the wood smooth beneath him, wood he'd planed and fitted and sealed himself. Grace emerged from the tree line, sensing something different in the morning's rhythm. She came closer than usual, maybe 15 feet away, and settled into the grass to watch. Calden turned the envelope over. Light. Couldn't be more than a single page inside. He opened it carefully, as if rough handling might make the words inside disappear. The paper inside was lined, torn from a notebook, the same careful handwriting as the envelope. Asterisk, Dad, asterisk, asterisk. I got your letter. I've read it maybe 20 times, trying to figure out what to say back. I'm not good at this. I've never been good at saying what I feel, and maybe I learned that from you, I don't know. Asterisk, asterisk. Here's what I know. I'm pregnant, due in about 2 months. July 15th, they think. The father isn't in the picture, his choice, not mine. I'm living with a roommate named Wendy who's been good to me, but she's moving out next month for a job in another state. I'm unemployed. I'm scared. I have no idea how to be a parent. Asterisk, asterisk. I thought about not telling you, but when I found out, you were the first person I thought of, which is stupid because we haven't talked in 3 years, and before that, you made it pretty clear you didn't want me in your life. Asterisk, asterisk. But then your letter came, and it said things I needed to hear 3 years ago. I don't know if I can forgive you yet. I don't know if I should. But I thought you deserved to know you're going to be a grandfather. Asterisk, asterisk. I'm not asking for anything. I just thought you should know. Asterisk, asterisk. Bryn times Calden read it 3 times, then a 4th. His hands were shaking so badly the paper rustled like leaves in wind. Pregnant. His daughter was pregnant. Due in 2 months. Alone and scared, and she'd thought of him. When she found out, he'd been her first thought, despite everything, and she'd written back. This careful, guarded letter that held hurt and hope in equal measure. She'd written back. He stood abruptly, pacing the porch. Grace startled and moved back toward the tree line, but she didn't flee entirely, just watched from a safer distance. A grandchild. He was going to be a grandfather. The enormity of it hit him like a physical force. Not just reconnecting with Bryn, though that alone would have been everything but being present for a new life. A chance to be the kind of grandfather his own father had been, patient, present, teaching with his hands the things that mattered. If she'd let him, she said she wasn't asking for anything. But the fact that she'd written meant something. Meant maybe the door wasn't completely closed, maybe forgiveness wasn't impossible. Calden went inside and sat at the table he'd built, pulling out paper and pen. This response couldn't wait weeks, couldn't be carefully crafted over days. It had to be immediate and honest. Asterisk Bryn. Asterisk, asterisk. Thank you for writing back. You have no idea what it means to me. Asterisk, asterisk. I know I don't deserve to be part of this. I know I failed you in every way that matters. But if you're willing, if there's any chance, I'd like to try to be there. Not to fix things or make demands. Just to be present. To help, if you'll let me. Asterisk, asterisk. I've spent the last few months rebuilding a cabin. Learning that broken things can be made whole if you're willing to do the work. I'm not the same person I was 3 years ago. I don't know if I'm better, but I'm trying to be. Asterisk. Asterisk. You said you're scared and don't know how to be a parent. I've got news for you, no one does. We're all just figuring it out as we go, but you don't have to figure it out alone. Asterisk, asterisk. I'm including my phone number. It's a new phone, but I check it when I go to town. If you want to call, I'd like to hear your voice. If you don't, I understand. But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, not this time. Asterisk. Asterisk. Congratulations on the baby. July 15th. I'll be thinking of you. Asterisk, asterisk, dad times. He addressed the envelope with hands that were steadier now. Purpose had a way of quieting the tremors of fear. He'd drive to town immediately, mail this before he could second-guess himself. But first, he sat at the table and let himself cry deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere primal. Not grief, exactly, something closer to release. The acknowledgement that maybe, impossibly, he was being given a second chance. Grace had returned to her spot near the porch. She watched him through the window, unafraid of his tears, just bearing witness the way the mountain itself had witnessed his rebuilding. When the tears stopped, Calden washed his face and tucked the letter carefully into his jacket. He looked around the cabin's solid walls, sound roof, windows that let in light instead of wind. A place someone could actually live, instead of just survive. He'd built this for himself, but maybe, somehow, he'd been building it for them too. The silence after mailing the second letter was worse than the first. At least before, Calden had the buffer of low expectations. Now, hope had crept in, dangerous and persistent, whispering possibilities he didn't dare believe in. He threw himself into work to keep from drowning in the waiting. Booker had 3 more commissions, a bookshelf, a desk, a set of chairs for the diner. Calden took them all, working in the borrowed workshop from first light until his hands cramped and his eyes blurred with sawdust. But at night, alone in the cabin, his mind turned endlessly to July 15th. 2 months away, then 6 weeks, then a month. He imagined Bryn growing rounder with pregnancy, struggling alone in a city apartment. Imagined her afraid and isolated the way he'd been afraid and isolated in those first terrible weeks at the cabin. The parallel wasn't lost on him, both of them. Rebuilding lives from ruins, both of them scared of what came next. 3 weeks after mailing his response, his phone rang. Calden had been in town picking up supplies. The phone was in his truck, and he almost didn't hear it over the engine noise. But he caught it on the 4th ring, pulling to the shoulder of the mountain road. Hello? Silence. Then breathing. Then a voice he would have recognized anywhere, even after 3 years. Dad? His throat closed. He tried to speak and couldn't. Just sat there, gripping the phone like a lifeline. I got your letter, Bryn continued, her voice uncertain. The second one, with your number. Bryn. Her name came out rough, barely a whisper. I'm calling because... She paused. I don't know why I'm calling. This is stupid. I shouldn't have... Don't hang up. The words burst from him. Please, just stay on the line. You don't have to say anything. Just stay. He heard her breathing, heard traffic in the background, the ambient noise of a city, heard her make a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh or both. I'm scared, she finally said, and the admission carried the weight of everything they hadn't said to each other for 3 years. I'm so scared, and I don't know what I'm doing, and the baby's coming, and I'm going to ruin everything. You won't. You don't know that. You're right. I don't. Calden closed his eyes, choosing honesty over comfort. But I know you're already better than I was, because you're admitting you're scared, because you're reaching out. That's what parents do. They show up even when they're terrified. You didn't. The words landed like a blow. Fair, accurate, deserved. No, I didn't, and I'll regret that until the day I die. He took a breath. But I'm showing up now, if you'll let me. More silence. Long enough that he thought she might have hung up. Then, can you come? I'm scared. The address is... She rattled off numbers and a street name. It's a long drive. I don't know if... I'll be there tomorrow. Tomorrow? That's you don't have to. What time works for you? He heard her crying now, not bothering to hide it. Afternoon? After 2. I'll be there at 2. He paused. Bryn, thank you for calling, for giving me this chance. Don't thank me yet, she said, but there was something in her voice that sounded almost like hope. You might get here and realize this was a mistake. It won't be. After she hung up, Calden sat on the shoulder of the mountain road for a long time. Watching the sun drop toward the western peaks, his daughter had called, had asked him to come, had given him an address and a time and an opening he couldn't waste. He drove back to the cabin in a daze, walked through the door and looked at the space with new eyes. The table, the chairs, the bed he'd built, the wooden bird on the windowsill, the photograph of young Bryn that still sat propped against the wall. All of it had been preparation for something, though he hadn't known what. Now he did. He went to Booker's workshop that evening and stood in front of the finest piece of white oak he could find, ran his hands over the wood, feeling its grain, its weight, its potential. This wasn't for a customer. This was for his grandchild. A cradle. He would build a cradle. Calden worked through the night, not from urgency but from need. The design came to him fully formed, simple lines, gentle curves, rockers that would move smoothly on any surface. Nothing ornate, nothing showy, just solid construction and careful joinery that would last generations. He cut the pieces with absolute precision. His father's level never left his side, checking and rechecking every angle. The rockers he shaped by hand, working the spokeshave until the curves were perfect. The headboard and footboard he carved with simple patterns, leaves and vines, symbols of growth and protection. By dawn, the basic structure was complete. He'd spend the next days fitting and finishing, but the bones were good, strong. This cradle would hold a child safely, would rock them to sleep, would be there for their children's children if he built it right. Booker found him in the workshop at sunrise, covered in sawdust, working on the spindles. "You been here all night?" Bryn called. "Asked me to come." Booker nodded slowly, a smile creasing his weathered face. "That's good. That's real good. She's due in a month." Alone, scared, Calden ran his hand along the cradle's rail. "I have to do this right." "You will." Booker studied the cradle. "This for the baby?" "Yeah. It's beautiful work. Best I've seen from you yet." He paused. "You going today?" "Tomorrow." She said afternoon. "Take the truck. Yours won't make it." Calden looked up. "What?" "Your truck's held together with rust and hope. Take mine. I've got the shop vehicle if I need to go anywhere." Booker pulled keys from his pocket and set them on the workbench. "Just bring it back in one piece." "Can't. You can, and you will. Don't make this about pride." Booker's tone was firm but kind. "Your daughter needs you. Don't show up in a vehicle that might break down halfway there." Calden took the keys, his throat tight. "I don't know how to thank you." "Then don't. Just be there for her. That's thanks enough." After Booker left, Calden returned to the cradle. He worked through the day, fitting pieces, sanding joints until they were glass smooth, applying the first coat of oil that would protect the wood and bring out its beauty. This wasn't just a cradle. It was a promise, a physical manifestation of his commitment to be present, to show up, to be the grandfather and father he should have been all along. He finished as the sun set, the cradle glowing golden in the workshop's light. Perfect wasn't possible, but this was as close as his hands could make it. Strong enough to last, beautiful enough to show he cared, built with enough love to maybe, possibly begin to make up for lost time. Grace was waiting when he returned to the cabin. She'd come right up to the porch now, no longer afraid. Calden sat on the steps, and she stood close enough that he could have touched her. "I'm going to meet my grandchild," he told her, "going to see my daughter for the first time in 3 years." The doe regarded him with those dark, knowing eyes. Then she stepped forward and nuzzled his hand once before disappearing into the twilight. Calden sat alone in the gathering dark, the cabin solid behind him, the cradle waiting in the workshop, and tomorrow opening before him like a door he'd been afraid to walk through, but finally had the courage to open. The drive took 11 hours, most of it through landscape that gradually shifted from mountains to plains to the sprawling outskirts of a city Calden barely recognized. He'd been here once, years ago, for a conference. It had been anonymous then. Now it held everything that mattered. The cradle rode in the truck bed, wrapped in blankets and secured with straps he'd checked 3 times before leaving. His hands gripped the steering wheel with a tension that made his shoulders ache. Every mile brought him closer to a moment he'd imagined 1,000 different ways, none of them adequate preparation for reality. Bryn's address led him to a neighborhood that had seen better decades, modest apartment buildings with peeling paint, cars that looked like they barely ran, a playground with broken swings. Not dangerous exactly, just worn down, tired, trying. He parked across the street and sat for several minutes, staring at the building. "3rd floor," she'd said. "Apartment 3, C." He could see windows up there, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. His daughter was behind one of those windows, pregnant, scared, waiting for him to show up or prove once again that he couldn't be counted on. Calden's hands were shaking. He gripped the steering wheel harder, trying to force them still. This was different from mailing letters. This was real, face to face, no time to craft perfect words or hide behind carefully chosen phrases, just him and Bryn and 3 years of silence between them. He got out of the truck before fear could convince him to drive away, opened the tailgate and carefully lifted the wrapped cradle. It was heavier than he remembered, solid in a way that felt grounding, physical proof that he'd been doing something besides running away. The stairwell smelled like cooking and old carpet. His footsteps echoed on the stairs. 3rd floor, turn left, apartment 3C at the end of the hall. He stood before the door, cradle in his arms, and for a long moment couldn't bring himself to knock. This was it, the threshold. Once he crossed it, there was no going back to the safe isolation of the cabin, the comfortable distance of letters. He knocked. 3 soft raps that sounded too loud in the quiet hallway, footsteps inside. A pause. Then the door opened. Bryn stood before him, and Calden's breath caught. She was visibly pregnant, her belly round beneath an oversized shirt. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, darker. But her eyes, those were still his daughter's eyes, though they held wariness now where there used to be only trust. They stared at each other. 3 years compressed into a single moment of recognition and assessment, and something too complicated to name. Bryn's eyes dropped to the cradle in his arms. Her face crumpled, tears spilling over before she could stop them. "You brought," her voice broke, "you built, for the baby." Calden managed, "I thought I wanted." The careful words he'd rehearsed during the drive disappeared. All that remained was the raw truth. "I'm sorry," he said. "For everything, for all of it. I'm so sorry, Bryn." She made a sound between a sob and a laugh, pressing her hand to her mouth. Then she stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in, please." The apartment was small but clean, furnished with mismatched pieces that spoke of thrift stores and hand-me-downs. A couch, a chair, a table with 2 seats, pictures on the walls, some Bryn's, some probably her roommates. A window that looked out over the neighborhood, light streaming through thin curtains. Calden set the cradle down carefully on the floor and unwrapped it. The wood glowed in the afternoon light, every detail visible. The carved headboard, the smooth rockers, the joints fitted so precisely they seemed to grow from a single piece. Bryn knelt beside it awkwardly, one hand supporting her belly. She traced the carvings with trembling fingers. "You made this," she whispered. "You actually made this. Every piece. Started it the night you called." He knelt beside her. "It's white oak. Should last generations if it's cared for." She looked at him then, really looked at him. Took in the changes 3 years, and a mountain winter had carved into his face. The new lines, the weathered skin, the calluses on his hands. "You look different. I am different." He paused. "Or maybe I'm who I was supposed to be all along. I don't know. Where have you been?" "Mountains. Bought a cabin that was falling apart. Spent the winter rebuilding it." The words felt inadequate. "Spent the winter rebuilding me." Bryn sat back on her heels, one hand on the cradle, one on her belly. "I was so angry at you. You had every right to be. I still am sometimes. Then your letters came and—" She shook her head. "I don't know what I feel. You don't have to know. You don't have to forgive me or trust me or even want me here." Calden's voice stayed steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I just want to be present. However that looks, whatever you're comfortable with." Bryn was quiet for a long moment, her hand moving in slow circles on her belly. Then she reached out and took his hand, placed it where hers had been. Beneath his palm, the baby moved. A kick, then another. Unmistakable, miraculous. Calden's carefully maintained. Composure shattered. Tears streamed down his face as he felt his grandchild moving, alive and real, and right there beneath his daughter's skin. "That's your granddaughter," Bryn said softly. "She's active. Keeps me up at night. A girl. Found out last month. I'm going to name her Iris, after your mother." The name hit him like a physical blow. His mother, who died when Bryn was just a baby, who'd been patient and kind and everything he'd forgotten how to be. She'd be honored, he managed. They sat together on the floor of the tiny apartment, Calden's hand on Bryn's belly, feeling his granddaughter kick and move, neither of them speaking because words weren't adequate for the moment. Outside, the city hummed. Inside, something broken began, tentatively, to mend. "Are you staying?" Bryn finally asked. "If you want me to." "I do." She squeezed his hand. I really do. They sat together in the small apartment as afternoon light stretched across the floor, the cradle between them like a bridge over 3 years of silence. Bryn made tea herbal, caffeine-free, and they sat on the worn couch that sagged in the middle. The conversation came in fits and starts, both of them learning how to talk to each other again. Tell me about the cabin, she said. So he did. Told her about arriving in a blizzard, about the roof collapsing, about nearly giving up that first terrible night, about Booker and his unexpected kindness, about learning to work with his hands again, remembering skills his father had taught him. I spent 20 years designing buildings, he said, but I'd forgotten what it meant to actually build something, to put your hands on wood and make it into something useful. Like the cradle. Like the cradle. Bryn traced the rim of her teacup. I was working as a graphic designer lost the job 4 months ago when the company downsized. Been applying everywhere since, but being pregnant. She shrugged. People say they're not discriminating, but they are. What about the father? Her face hardened. He was very clear about not wanting to be involved. Suggested I shouldn't keep the baby. When I said I was, he left. Haven't heard from him since. Calden felt anger rise hot in his chest, but he pushed it down. That wasn't what she needed from him. His loss. His daughter's loss. He set down his tea. What do you need? Practically. What can I help with? I don't know. She looked around the apartment. Wendy's moving out in 2 weeks. I can't afford this place alone. I've been looking at cheaper apartments, but most landlords see pregnant and unemployed, and her voice cracked. I don't know how I'm going to do this. You're not going to do it alone. Dad, you live in a cabin in the mountains. You're not exactly positioned to, I have some money now, from carpentry work. It's not much, but it's something. He leaned forward. And the cabin, it's not just livable now. It's good, solid. There's space. She looked at him sharply. What are you saying? I'm saying, if you need a place, you have one. No rent, no pressure. Just somewhere safe until you figure out your next step. The words came faster, now, urgent, or I could help you find something here, first month's rent, deposit, whatever you need. I'm not trying to make decisions for you. I just want you to know you have options. Bryn's eyes filled with tears again. Why now? Why couldn't you have been this person 3 years ago? Because 3 years ago I was drowning and I was too proud to admit it. Because I thought being a failure in private was better than letting you see me fail. He met her eyes. I was wrong. About everything. And I can't take back those 3 years. But I can show up now, if you'll let me. She put her face in her hands and cried deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere beyond words. Calden moved closer and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him the way she used to when she was small and the world felt too big. I'm so tired, she whispered. I'm so tired of being scared and alone. I know. He held her while she cried. This daughter he'd failed, who was giving him a chance he didn't deserve, but would spend the rest of his life trying to earn. When the tears subsided, Bryn pulled back and wiped her eyes. The cabin. Tell me more about it. Is there really room? There's a loft. I could build a proper bedroom up there. Put in a real bed, a changing table, whatever you need. The ideas came fast, his architectural mind engaging with the problem. The main floor has good light. We could partition off a section for privacy if you wanted. Or build an addition if you stay longer term. You'd do that? I'd do anything. She looked at the cradle again, her hand resting on her belly. I need to think about it. It's a lot. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. He paused. But Bryn, whatever you decide, I'm here. If you stay in the city, I'll visit. If you come to the cabin, I'll make it work. This isn't about me trying to control things or fix things my way. It's about showing up, however that looks. She nodded slowly. Can you stay tonight? There's a couch that folds out. It's not comfortable, but I'll stay as long as you want me to. They ordered take-out Chinese food from a place down the street that Bryn said was decent. Ate on the couch while she told him about her pregnancy, the appointments, the morning sickness that had lasted all day for weeks, the strange cravings, and the way her body had changed in ways both miraculous and terrifying. Calden listened more than he talked, learning about his daughter's life, the pieces she'd built while he'd been absent. She had friends, plans, dreams that had been deferred but not abandoned. She was stronger than he'd given her credit for, stronger than he'd been at her age. As evening settled over the city, Bryn grew tired. The baby's movements visible now, beneath her shirt small rolls and pokes that made her wince. "She's running out of room," Bryn said, rubbing her side. "Doctor says she's positioned well. Head down, ready." "Are you ready?" "No, but I don't think anyone really is." She looked at him. "Were you? When I was born?" "Terrified. Your mother and I had read every book, taken every class. The second they handed you to me, I realized I had no idea what I was doing." He smiled at the memory. "But you were so small and perfect and ours, and somehow we figured it out. And then you forgot." The words weren't cruel, just honest. They hung in the air between them. "And then I forgot," he agreed quietly. "But I remember now." Summer arrived, full and warm, painting the valley in shades of green that seemed impossible after the long winter. The cabin stood solid against the backdrop of mountains, its new windows reflecting morning light, the porch wide enough for 2 chairs and a small table where coffee could be shared in comfortable silence. Calden stood on that porch in early August, watching the sunrise paint the peaks gold and rose. Behind him, the cabin was quiet but full. Bryn, asleep in the loft he'd converted into a proper bedroom, and in the corner by the fireplace, the hand-carved cradle that now held his granddaughter. Iris had arrived on July 18th, 3 days late, and worth every second of anxious waiting. Calden had been there for the birth, holding Bryn's hand while she screamed and cried and pushed this new life into the world. When the nurse placed the baby in his arms, 7 pounds, dark hair, lungs that worked perfectly, he'd wept openly. This tiny creature representing everything he'd thought he'd lost forever. They'd stayed in the city for 2 weeks after the birth, Calden sleeping on Bryn's couch and learning the strange rhythms of newborn life. Midnight feedings, endless diaper changes, the particular panic that came from not knowing why a baby was crying. He'd been clumsy at first, his large hands uncertain with something so fragile. But Bryn had been patient, showing him how to support Iris's head, how to read her different cries, how to simply be present without trying to fix everything. "You're better at this than I expected," Bryn had said one night, watching him rock Iris back to sleep. "I have better priorities this time," he'd answered. When Wendy moved out and the lease came up for renewal, Bryn had made her decision. The cabin. At least for now. At least until she figured out what came next. They'd made the drive together in Booker's borrowed truck, Iris secured in a car seat that Calden had researched obsessively to ensure it was the safest available. The baby had slept most of the way, occasionally waking to fuss before settling again. Bryn's face, when she first saw the cabin that moment, had been worth every frozen finger, every aching muscle, every doubt-filled night of the previous winter. "You built this?" she'd asked, standing in the doorway, taking in the solid walls, the furnished interior, the light streaming through real windows. "We're still building it," he'd said. "Together now." That had been 3 weeks ago. In those weeks, the cabin had transformed again. Baby supplies now mixed with Calden's sparse furnishings, a changing table he'd built from pine, shelves for tiny clothes, a rocking chair by the fireplace where Bryn nursed Iris while Calden cooked dinner or worked on his latest commission. They'd developed routines. Calden took the early morning shift, getting up with Iris when she woke at 5 so Bryn could sleep a few more hours. He'd change her, rock her, talk to her in the quiet dawn, light about everything and nothing. The mountain, the deer, her mother, his hopes for her future. Bryn handled most of the day, but Calden was always nearby if she needed him. He'd converted part of Booker's workshop space to take commissions from home, building furniture that people drove from 3 counties over to purchase. Word had spread about his craftsmanship, and there was enough work now to support them both, modest but sufficient. Evenings they spent together, the 3 of them, learning how to be a family. Sometimes Booker visited, bringing supplies and stories, holding Iris with a gentleness that spoke of remembered practice. He'd become a grandfather of sorts himself, this gruff old man who'd extended credit to a stranger and somehow become essential. "She's got your eyes," Booker had said last week, peering at Iris's face. "Both of you, family eyes." Grace still appeared most evenings, though she kept more distance now, with the baby's sounds and smells changing the cabin's character. But she was there, a constant presence, and sometimes Bryn would stand on the porch with Iris in her arms, showing her the deer, telling her about the mountain that would be part of her growing up. The sound of the cabin door opening pulled Calden from his thoughts. Bryn emerged, hair pulled back, Iris against her shoulder. The baby was awake but quiet, her dark eyes taking in the morning. "She's been up for an hour," Bryn said, settling into the chair beside Calden's. "Just watching everything. I think she likes it here. Smart girl. Knows a good place when she sees one." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the day wake up around them. A hawk circled overhead. The creek sang its endless song. Somewhere in the trees, a woodpecker began its staccato rhythm. "I've been thinking," Bryn said after a while, "about staying. Not just for a few months, really staying." Calden's heart jumped, but he kept his voice steady. "Yeah? I could work remotely. Freelance design. There's internet in town, and I could drive down once a week to meet with clients if needed." She adjusted Iris on her shoulder. "And I want her to grow up like this, with space, with family, with someone who shows up. I'll always show up now." "I know." She looked at him, and for the first time in 3 years there was no wariness in her eyes. Just acceptance. Maybe even forgiveness. "You've shown me that." Calden reached over and gently took Iris from Bryn's arms. His granddaughter settled against his chest, her tiny hand curling around his finger. She smelled like milk and baby soap and possibility. "Your great-grandfather taught me to build with my hands," he told Iris, though she couldn't understand the words. "Taught me that anything broken can be fixed if you're patient and willing to do the work. I forgot that for a long time. But your mom, she gave me a chance to remember." Bryn wiped her eyes. "Don't make me cry before breakfast. Too late for that, I think." They laughed, the sound carrying across the valley. Inside the cabin, Calden's journal sat on the table, the latest entry still wet with ink. Asterisk, day 147. Bryn says she wants to stay, really stay. Iris is 6 weeks. Old and already has her mother's determination and her grandmother's name. The cabin I built to save myself has become something bigger, a home for 3 generations, a place where broken things get rebuilt. Asterisk, asterisk. I came here with nothing but failures and a gamble on a piece of land, sight unseen. I'm leaving with everything that matters. Not leaving permanently, this is home now, but leaving behind the man who was too afraid to show up, too proud to admit he needed help, too broken to believe he could be whole again. Asterisk, asterisk. The wind still blows through this valley, but it doesn't sound like a warning anymore. It sounds like a welcome, like the mountain saying, "You belong here now. You and yours." Asterisk. Later that afternoon, Booker arrived with lumber for the addition. They'd planned a proper bedroom and bathroom, expanding the cabin to accommodate their growing family. Fitch came too, offering help without being asked, bringing tools and expertise and the easy friendship of men who understood the value of building something together. They worked while Bryn and Iris napped inside, the sound of hammers and saws, a rhythm that spoke of construction rather than destruction, of creating rather than collapsing. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the clearing, Calden stepped back to survey their progress. The foundation was laid, the framing begun. By summer's end, the addition would be complete. Another thing built right, built to last. Grace emerged from the tree line, and this time she came all the way to the porch. Calden sat on the steps, and she stood close enough to touch. He reached out slowly, and she allowed his hand to rest briefly on her neck before stepping back. "Thank you," he told her, "for being here, for witnessing all of it." She regarded him with those dark, knowing eyes, then turned and disappeared into the gathering dusk. Inside, Iris began to cry, the hungry cry that Calden now recognized immediately. He went in to find Bryn already lifting her from the cradle, settling into the rocking chair by the fireplace. "Can you get the lasagna out of the oven?" she asked. "Should be done." On it. They ate dinner together while Iris slept in the cradle, full and content. Booker and Fitch joined them, and the small cabin felt warm and full and exactly right. They talked about the addition, about upcoming projects, about Iris and her milestones, and the particular joy of watching a new person discover the world. After everyone left and Bryn had gone to bed, Calden stood on the porch one last time. He pulled out the 2 photographs he kept in his jacket, the old one of young Bryn at the lake and the new one they'd taken last week, all 3 of them on this porch. Iris in Bryn's arms, Calden's hand on his daughter's shoulder, all of them smiling. Both photos told true stories, one of what had been lost, one of what had been rebuilt. He went inside and placed them both on the mantel, side by side, the old one and the new one, the past and the present, the breaking and the healing. In the cradle, Iris stirred and settled, her small sounds filling the cabin with life. Upstairs, Bryn's breathing was steady and peaceful. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and solid, and the wind moved through the pines with the sound of endless belonging. Calden Roury had come here broken, bankrupt, carrying nothing but failures and one last desperate chance. He'd rebuilt a cabin, board by board, nail by nail, and in the process, he'd rebuilt himself. But more than that, he'd learned what truly mattered. Not the buildings he'd designed or the money he'd lost. Not even the cabin itself, though it had been the tool of his transformation. What mattered was this: showing up, being present, building not monuments to ambition but spaces where love could grow. The wind didn't let up, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It sounded like welcome, like home, like the mountain itself breathing in, rhythm with the 3 lives sheltered beneath its watch. Calden banked the fire, checked the doors, and climbed the ladder to his small sleeping space in what had been the loft. Tomorrow, they'd frame more walls. Tomorrow, Iris would grow a little bigger. Tomorrow, life would continue its patient work of renewal. But tonight, everything was exactly as it should be. Broken things made whole, lost things found. A family rebuilt, one careful board at a time.